So last time I spoke in London, I talked about Mary Wollstonecraft, which I do quite often, and I will have reason to say a bit about her and her feminist republicanism today as well. She does have a place, I think, in any discussion on inequality and rights from a Republican perspective, which will be my focus in this talk. So like Wasim said, I am now involved in writing about economic inequality in relation to human rights and also to various aspects of economic vulnerability. And I am starting on a transdisciplinary project on cash dependence and cashlessness in a society which in Sweden is moving very rapidly towards a cashless payment market, where particularly poor people is at the risk of being locked out of the official economy simply because they are cash dependent and have the wrong kind of money. I will not talk about that aspect of this today. I will talk more about principles of thinking about socioeconomic justice, but it's also those kinds of concerns. So not only the sort of grand theory kind of approaches to socioeconomic inequality, but how economic inequality impacts people in everyday situations in ways that we don't always recognize as injustices. But so my perspective into these issues will be what is often referred to as Republican theory, and I will let Wollstonecraft ease me into this. She does that well. Wollstonecraft, of course, a feminist philosopher in the radical and late Enlightenment of the late 18th century. Her political thought is a feminist revision of republicanism from within Republican commitments to the independence of persons in a free and equal society. And the conception of freedom associated with republicanism would be central to this talk. It's usually referred to as freedom as non-domination, and I will use that term. This notion of freedom has, as I'm sure you know, been revived in recent times, not least by Quentin Skinner, who prefers the term neo-Roman liberty for very good reasons, because there is nothing necessarily Republican about it. But the historical figures that I have been mostly interested in, like Wollstonecraft, really were Republicans, and it has become a recognizable label, so I would use it for convenience. So starting with that, just to get that on the table, on this view, social freedom is a function of relationships. It's my standing in relation to others. So if I am in a position of subjection to others, vulnerable to their arbitrary will, I am unfree by the mere fact of their power to restrict me, should they so wish, even if they don't exercise it. And if they do, I have no or insufficient means to counter them or appeal against them. I am at their mercy, as we say, and they can be the state, or it can be other people on whose arbitrary will I depend, be it an employer, a husband, a rich benefactor. And my focus today will be on Republican freedom in relation to socioeconomic power. And I should maybe declare at the outset that I come to these questions as an egalitarian, and I am an egalitarian for what we might call Republican reasons. Freedom as non-domination, the core political value of Republican theory, creates a presumption in favor of socioeconomic equality, and I will try to show why. So this is then the problem that I want to discuss, and it's a current one. It's socioeconomic inequality as a question of justice. This is a perennial question, of course, but there is new attention on it now in our time. The changes in the world cannot be ignored towards ever greater economic inequality and concentration of wealth. There is also an important interesting revival of research in economics by Thomas Piketty, Anthony Atkinson, Branko Milanovic, and others, who also approached economics in a much broader way than has become customary, where economics is studied politically and historically. And their statistics on economic inequality go back at least 200 years. So it's about today, but it's also about patterns over time. So over these last decades, there has been a rapid increase in economic inequality of income and wealth within many countries, including where I am, Sweden, who used to pride itself on its egalitarian society, and even more so where I'm assuming that most of you are, in the UK. And this is a global trend. I won't go into these statistics. We only need the general picture, really, for our purposes here. But over this same time period, that we can see that inequality has increased, which started in the 1980s and then has continued and accelerated. Over that same time period, or at least the last 20 years or so, absolute poverty has also has decreased. The globally fewer people are in absolute poverty. So these two things are happening at the same time, that absolute poverty is going down, while inequality between people within countries is rapidly increasing. So the gap is widening between rich and poor, even though the number of poor people might be getting fewer, depending on how you measure poverty. And particularly striking is the concentration of wealth in the hands of a relatively small group of very rich people, which is also a democratic problem. So this recent increase in economic inequality follows on a period of lessening inequality. Over the first half of the 20th century or so, inequality went down. And a rough explanation of that was that wealthy people lost money in the Depression and in the wars. So the top went down the first decades of the 20th century. And then poor people gained in the post-war welfare state projects. So the bottom went up. And the increase in inequality that we now see accelerating since the 1980s is mainly the well-off gaining due to a number of things: liberalization of financial markets and changes in fiscal policy that benefits those at the higher end of the economy. And of course, tax evasion, as was revealed recently in the newly leaked Pandora Papers. Now, the point here is that these fluctuations in inequality, where it sometimes goes up, sometimes goes down. It went up during the 19th century, down again in 20th century, now it's going up again. These fluctuations can always be explained, even though the exact explanations might differ and be contested. The fact that they can always be explained is not contested. So they are not flukes, they are not forces of nature. They are not freak incidents, they are consequences of economic and political activity. So allowing economic inequality to increase is a political choice. But are these inequalities unjust? Is the gap between rich and poor unjust? We're not talking about the poverty levels, we're talking about the gap. Well, one argument in the Republican tradition is that top-end wealth, particularly inherited, unearned wealth, is a moral problem for society because luxury fosters vanity and corrupts the character. Luxury also corrupts the political structure of society because the rich can buy political influence, and they still do. They can also buy their way out of civic obligations. Like Benjamin Constant said, rich men hire stewards. Now, this notion that wealth is a morally corrupting factor in society is very clearly Wollstonecraft's position. Her imagery of this is vivid and violent. The adulation of property is a poisoned fountain of vice. But other Republicans in the same time period, like Thomas Paine, saw private wealth as potentially good because it's a taxable asset in the state. In Paine's essay, Agrarian Justice, which he published in 1797, he outlines a general social insurance scheme funded by an inheritance tax on land. And he says in that essay, and I quote, "I care not how affluent some may be, provided that none be miserable in consequence of it," unquote. So the job is to make wealth work for good purposes. Wealth is useful, potentially, because it is exploitable for good purposes. You can tax it for the benefit of the poor. So there has always been views about this, varying ones in the Republican tradition. Now, I will now approach the question of the income and wealth gap as a potential injustice, and I would do it by identifying 3 normative approaches to this as a problem. And all these 3 normative approaches have some plausibility. I will refer to them as the distributive, the relational, and the fixed standards approach. Now I will concentrate on the last 2, mainly because that's where my interests lie today, and I need them to make my point. And my point will be to try to show that there are reasons to favor what I will refer to as the relational approach to socioeconomic inequality as an injustice, particularly if you think that freedom as non-domination is a crucial political value, which you do if you're a Republican. I will also address a complication, which is the fact that human rights theory tends to support another approach, the fixed standards approach, and I will soon explain what these approaches are. But as we will see, Republicans have reason to reject the fixed standards approach. And this is a quandary, since human rights theory is useful for Republicans, and human rights are important in Republican theory. Indeed, for the 18th century Republicans that I've been referring to, rights are fundamental principles in the design of a free society. Rights mark the difference between treating people as free citizens or as subjects under masters. So I will end today by offering a Republican reinterpretation of human rights that supports an egalitarian relational approach to socioeconomic justice. Now, here's a reminder first. In matters of political and civic liberties, I'm thinking of things like a right to vote, right to a fair trial, there is virtually complete consensus that a principle of strict equality applies. There is no defensible principle to say that some people have 3 votes in a general election while others have 1 or none. But in matters of socioeconomic rights, there is strong consensus that the job of principles of justice is to settle which inequalities that we can be prepared to live with, what inequalities can be justified and why. A problem with that is that any pattern of inequality is historically contingent. It will serve some interests and not others. Any change in inequality, as I just said, can be explained by economic and political agency, by decisions taken and interests that have won out. When theorists develop and apply normative principles of justice in order to assess whether existing inequalities are unfair or not, the risk is that we serve to reify the historically contingent and elevate circumstances that are the consequence of powerful interests winning out as justified states of affairs and thus worthy of protection. With this in mind, we will now look at the 3 approaches: the distributive, the fixed standards, and the relational approaches to socioeconomic justice. And I am, needless to say, not claiming that this in any way exhausts the field. With a distributive approach to socioeconomic justice, I mean an approach which uses a metric or a criterion by which to assess whether a distribution of resources or opportunities between people in a society is non-objectionable. Say that your favored criterion is that distribution should be according to merit. So if inequalities in wages, say, can be traced to differences in merit, then they are fair because each deserves what they have. Some people work harder perhaps, or make significant contributions of some kind. So this approach where you assess inequalities using a metric that that you favor has intuitive appeal, I think. It can work well in small settings. We are familiar with these kinds of argument, particularly when discussing wage structures and inequalities in wages. But it's difficult to make into policy without arbitrariness. But I would bracket this approach and concentrate on the other two. I put it on the table because it is so widely used and referred to. But I will not use it for the remainder of the argument. So on a fixed standards approach, what I mean by that is an approach where the focus is on what each person viewed separately has or needs, measured against a standard of adequacy. Say, whatever is needed to survive or whatever is needed to live a decent life, depending on your level of ambition. So this is an approach that requires agreement on an acceptable level of resources or capacities, an acceptable floor under which no one should be allowed to fall. So a secured threshold level of resources or capacities. And as long as everyone is at least on that minimum, there is no injustice, even if some are way above it, whereas the others are just on it. So each person is compared to the level, not to each other, right? The fixed standards approach is very common in practical political discourse. Defense of it is often pragmatic. The idea of a minimum wage is informed by it. And I think that's the intuitive appeal comes from the fact that some basic security against misery seems reasonable, but also because you don't trample on the economic interests of more privileged classes, which can safely continue to believe in that their wealth trickles down. Okay, so defense of fixed standards approaches, like I said, it's often pragmatic. This is also an approach which is common in development theory, discussing poverty and poverty levels. A benefit of the fixed standards approach is that it's easy to evaluate progress. That's one reason why it is used in development theory. If you want to measure differences in poverty levels over time, having a fixed standard by which to decide where the poverty level is and measure people against that is an easy way to assess whether progress is being made. But human rights theory, as it usually looks today, offers a principled defense of the fixed standards approach. Human rights theorists have two reasons to like it. One is the focus on urgent needs. So using the language of human rights to talk about what is deemed to be absolutely necessary for a life to be decent maintains the edge or the sense of urgency that when you're talking about human rights, you're talking about stuff that really matters. If you use the language of human rights to talk about goods that seem not so urgent, but perhaps more good to have, the concept is, the fear is, will be watered down and lose its edge. So the human right to food is the right to basic foodstuffs, not to a lavish buffet, even though some do get the lavish buffet. The human right to education is the right to enough education to get by in modern society, not to a university degree, even though some will get the university degree while others can't afford it. So a rights claim to socioeconomic goods regarded in this way is a claim to be on that level of what is regarded as adequate. The second reason why human rights theorists have reason to prefer the fixed standards approach lies in the expression I just used, claims. It's theoretical orthodoxy now to say that human rights have a particular form. They have the form of claims, or claiming. So having a right is to have a strong justified claim to some object, be it food or education or whatever. And there is by necessity some other agent, the government, say, or other institutions, with a corresponding duty to secure the object of the right for me as claimant. So this form that rights take, claiming the performance of a duty, which is the form of deontic logic in philosophy, harmonizes well with fixed standards, where each person claims a certain good rather than claims to occupy a certain space in a relational structure. So if I say, I claim of you a wage that I can live on, that makes good sense within this form that rights take as claiming. While saying that I claim of you an equal wage structure on the labor market makes much less sense as a claim of this form, claiming the performance of a duty. We will see, or I will try to show, that Republicans have reason to reject this way of thinking about socioeconomic rights as individual claims to a sufficiency level, despite the fact that Republicans use human rights language and perhaps even need human rights language. They have reason to reject the approach to socioeconomic justice that human rights theory, as it is often formulated, takes. I will get back to that when I have presented the third approach, which is the relational approach to socioeconomic inequality. So we have the distributive, the fixed standards, and now the relational approach to socioeconomic inequality. Now, the relational approach does not focus on distributive metrics. It doesn't talk about merits or desert or anything like that. Neither does it focus on adequacy levels, at least not directly. The focus on relational approaches is the consequences of a pattern of distribution of economic resources for how people live together. So the consequences of inequality, if you like, for the relationships that people are in, on society considered as a community of people living together. So inequality need not be bad in itself, but if it has detrimental consequences in some significant way for the relationships we are in, it is unjust for that reason. Now, there is empirical support, strong empirical support, that there are such detrimental consequences. In economic inequality can be securely linked to social costs like delinquency, corruption, lack of trust, and also democratic costs. Okay, so we know from empirical studies that economic inequality, at least when it is substantial, has these detrimental consequences for how societies work. But Republican theory can provide a principled egalitarian defense of the relational approach as a as an account of socioeconomic injustice. Crucial for a Republican approach to socioeconomic justice is to say that resources are not only resources that you can buy stuff with, resources are powers. They are powers to do things, but they can also translate into power over others. The domination is partly constituted by inequalities in economic power. There is emerging work on this in Republican theory. It has been a relatively neglected issue, but there is now quite a lot of interesting work coming out on Republican theory in connection specifically with socioeconomic justice. I'm happy to provide references if anyone is interested. A crucial point here is this, that economic inequality, particularly within economic institutions that are insufficiently democratic, translates into power over others. So if that is the situation, economic inequalities translate into powers over others, what should the Republican response be? Is egalitarianism the proper response for a Republican, a close the gap kind of argument? I would suggest that it is. Others, including Philip Pettit and Lisa Herzog, think that we can formulate a variation of an adequacy level kind of account in non-domination terms, such that each person should have enough resources for independent economic agency, that there is an adequacy level to identify where each is free from dominating dependence on others. I think that's a false choice, and I will now try and explain what I mean by that. I started out saying that freedom as non-domination creates a presumption in favor of socioeconomic equality, not adequacy levels, and that is what I will now say a bit about. So ponder then that we would try to identify a Republican adequacy level, a level of resources for each, such that each person is free from dominating economic dependence on others. I will suggest that this cannot really be done because it will inevitably, any adequacy level that we will try to identify in terms of non-domination will inevitably a function not only of what I have, but of how much more others have, how they spend their money, and how that affects me. Here's a concrete example of how this can work. How much is sufficient to buy a decent place to live? Well, you're in London, most of you, so you will know that the answer to that is more than most people can afford. So then why are houses so expensive? Well, one reason for that is that real estate is a financial asset. So rich people buy houses they don't need as investment or to park their money. And as a consequence, inevitably prices go up. And those who benefit from that are the people who already own those houses. So they will get richer as a consequence of their own speculation, while poorer people will be priced out of the housing market. So the economic behavior of the rich makes the less well-off poorer, not by taking resources from them, but by pricing goods out of their reach. So any attempt at settling a sufficiency level, the resources necessary for whatever basic needs, non-domination, is always set in part by the activities of those who are richer. So the activities of people with more money than you will affect the resources that you can use without the relatively poor being able to do anything about that. So they will have to accept increasing economic precarity, less economic agency as a consequence of the economic behavior of the relatively better off. They are, as we might say, at their mercy. That's domination, right? And we cannot address that with a level of sufficiency, because the level of sufficiency itself will be a function of the consequences of the economic behavior of the rich. So the only proper response that a Republican could make to that, I would suggest, is that economic power needs to be restrained. Egalitarianism, then. A possible objection to this is, of course, what I mentioned before, that sufficiency approaches or fixed standards approaches, concentrating on adequacy levels, have the benefit of easier enforceability. Human rights take the form of claims to socioeconomic sufficiency for a reason. It's easier to know when you've done the right thing, or when you've done enough of the right thing. But my conclusion from this is that any attempt at setting an adequacy level which could in any meaningful way account for non-domination is a futile project, because any sufficiency level will be a function of economic power and the economic behavior of the relatively rich. But if human rights and claims which have the benefit of being supported by human rights theory is a resource that Republicans need, how do Republicans account for the human rights that they need in their theory if they want to avoid the fixed standard approach to socioeconomic justice that the notion of claiming supports? Well, I think that Republicans have all sorts of good reasons, and the socioeconomic justice problem is only one of them, to adopt a wider approach to human rights and not think of human rights merely as individual claims to goods. So instead of seeing human rights as a list of claimable goods, Republicans should see human rights as an infrastructure for a free society, a design for how institutions, including economic institutions, work. And I will try to explain how now. We can ask different questions about human rights. We can ask, what is a human right? Then we are asking a question about the concept. We can ask, what human rights are there? In which case we're asking for the extension of the concept, the list of rights that people can claim. But Republicans should want to ask another question first, and that question changes the stakes a bit. And that question is, what are human rights for? What is their point? What are they there to do? And a Republican answer to that question is surely that the point of human rights is to protect people against oppression and the abuse of power, and to empower people to act independently. So how does that prior question, what is the point of human rights, affect how we think about what rights are? I will now invoke Wollstonecraft and her circle again. The kind of rights discourse that we find in Mary Wollstonecraft proceeds from the fact of power, and that some are able to put others at risk and impose their will upon them. So a right to freedom is the right to be protected from that, so that independent agency is possible. When Wollstonecraft's contemporary, Richard Price, talks of a right to resist power when abused, he is not thinking of this right as a claim to a good. He's thinking of it as a kind of moral power, a capacity to resist, without which persons are in a state of subjection. Wollstonecraft emphasizes that the birthright, as she calls it, of liberty, requires, among other things, civic self-government. And again, this is not an item on a list of claimable goods. It is required by the definition of liberty itself. I said before that rights are an infrastructure rather than a list of goods. Here's one way to understand that. For me to be able to claim anything against anybody, to make a claim to an object in relation to some agent who's duty bound to provide me with it, that ability to claim, for that, I need to have a certain standing already, or why would anyone care? So being free on Republican theory requires that you have security in your status as a person. And that security is prior to the capacity to claim. It is necessary for the capacity to claim. A slave cannot make a claim. In order to capture this prior standing, which is required for claiming, we need to widen and make the rights language more complex. And in the early 20th century, the American jurist Wesley Hofeld made a classic typology of rights, which is in fact very useful for Republican theory. Claims on Hofeld's typology are but one form that rights can take. Of particular Republican relevance are two other forms that rights can take, which are powers and immunities. Powers and immunities are not rights in the sense of I require this of you, but they are a kind of status positions. And here is an example. The right to vote. What is the right to vote? Well, in one sense, the right to vote is a claim. The claim to be allowed to vote in elections. The claim perhaps that fair elections are held. But in a prior sense, the right to vote is a power, a status position. By virtue of my status as citizen, I can perform the act of casting a vote that others are bound to accept. If I don't have that pre-existing status, this power right, I cannot perform the act of casting a vote. It is dependent upon that. And I cannot claim the right to be allowed to vote without that prior existing power. Now, my power right, my status position as a citizen, is also a precondition for my ability to claim any kind of good from institutions. So the difference between claiming social benefits, for instance, and asking for help is explained by the prior existing power right, the social standing that makes it possible for me, by virtue of that standing as a citizen, to make claims. Without it, I cannot claim anything. So these rights sort of stand in a relation of varying fundamentality to each other. Here's another example. The right to be regarded as a person in the eyes of the law can be characterized as an immunity. It's an immunity right. It offers legal protection against arbitrary violations by the state. It is by virtue of that status, by that immunity, that I can claim, for instance, legal representation. So without these prior status positions, I cannot make claims. And that prior status position is a crucial aspect of what Republican freedom is, composed of powers and immunities that are prior forms of right. So in that sense, rights are not, as I said before, just a list of claimable goods, but rights make up an infrastructure of status and claiming, prior status positions, powers and immunities that need to be in place and that need to secure my powers and my immunities so that I can make claims. It might be true that substantial economic inequality, the concentration of wealth, is compatible with securing some kind of basic goods for all, but it's not compatible with equal powers and immunities. To give a mundane, everyday example, the poorer you are, the more likely you are to be stopped and searched by police, which also means that the poorer you are, the more strategic you need to be when you move around in public. Your immunity against arbitrary intervention is lesser the poorer you are. This also has a gendered and racial dimension, as recent events involving the police tragically show. So Republicans, proceeding from a freedom of non-domination, have reason then to prefer, of these different accounts of distributive justice, a relational egalitarian approach. Even though human rights theory tends to support a competing approach, the fixed standards approach, which Republicans have reason to reject, this is only an indication that human rights theory tend to be too narrowly focused on claims to goods, rather than a more complex account of rights as an infrastructure of powers and immunities as necessary requirements, setting up, constituting the kind of status that people need in order to then make claims. I will conclude with going back to Mary Wollstonecraft and a reflection on the lived experience of what it is to live a life which by Republican standards is unfree. She talks about women, but the point is general. So living an unfree life, while laws and norms and philosophy argues that the inequality is justified, that your poverty is on an adequate level, that obedience is right for you, that will work on a person's mind. It would produce a kind of slavish mentality of acceptance. And power, tyranny triumphs when the slaves no longer question why they are not free, we know that. And when the poor take handouts with gratitude. The point here is that there is a dynamic to inequality which works on us, normalizing it, making it all look and feel familiar and right, perhaps even voluntary. So any egalitarian analysis of socioeconomic injustice will need to start there with how inequality is normalized in us and in our discourse. Wollstonecraft talks of the philosophical eye. Seeing the world through the philosophical eye is to see it through the eye of the dispossessed, the poor, the women, the slaves, not by claiming to represent their interests, but by seeing the world as they live in it. So unraveling the normalization of inequality requires several things. It requires committing to the right principles, but it also requires committing to this method, investigating what it is like to live a dominated life, what strategies it requires, and also count the testimony of the dispossessed as philosophically valid knowledge.